Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Listener name. Usually when you look at a legal document or, say, a formal declaration from a court, there is a strict expectation of rigid boundaries.
Yeah, that is very true.
You read a contract, you sign on the dotted line, and the terms are set in stone. The definitions are categorical. You are either legally liable or you are clear. You are guilty or you are acquitted.
It is an entirely binary system.
Hmm.
And human beings prefer that framework. I mean, we like things to be visibly categorized, to have defined edges.
Right.
So we know our precise standing within the system.
But today we are stepping into a legal framework that, well, it shatters those neat, comfortable little categories.
Oh, without a doubt.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape of the human condition that is entirely unvarnished. It was written by a man who understood the law better than almost anyone in his generation.
He really did.
So our mission for this deep dive is to conduct an extensive line-by-line analysis of the opening chapter of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans.
Which is quite an undertaking.
Oh, it is. And we are guiding our analysis through the lens of the Bible Knowledge Commentary.
Right, by John F. Walvoord and his colleagues.
Yes. The goal here is to unpack Paul's opening arguments regarding the gospel, the mechanics of justification by faith, and God's righteous judgment on human rebellion.
And we really have to approach this understanding that this is not an academic exercise in ancient history.
No, not at all.
We are decoding ancient legal and theological terminology because it directly dictates the reality of your standing before God today.
Right. We want to understand how a letter written thousands of years ago to a group of believers in the capital of the Roman Empire maps onto our reality right now.
Yeah, that is the core goal.
So let us begin by looking at the actual anatomy of the letter itself. When you study the customary formula for writing a letter in the ancient Greco-Roman world, it followed a highly predictable, standardized pattern.
Oh, definitely. The sender would state their name and identify themselves, and they would name and identify the recipient, and they would finish the introduction with a brief word of greeting or salutation.
It was basically the ancient equivalent of an email header.
That is a great way to put it. You have the from line, the to line, and the subject line. It was efficient, formal, and strictly adhered to by educated members of society.
And Paul starts off following this formula. He hits all three of those required marks in his letter to the Romans, but the commentary points out something fascinating.
Yeah, he includes this massive, seemingly out-of-control digression right in the middle of his own introduction.
Right, and it is entirely precipitated by his use of a single word, which is gospel.
The psychology of the author is on full display here. I mean, he states his name, but the moment he mentions the message he carries, he simply cannot restrain himself.
He just has to talk about it.
Yes, he launches into this glorious sweeping tangent, outlining the theological weight of that message before he even finishes saying hello to his audience.
Wow.
If you look at the chart provided in our source material detailing Paul's introductions across all his epistles, you notice a distinct pattern, but also some striking variations depending on his audience.
That is really interesting.
Yeah, this customary formula is utilized in all the New Testament letters except for Hebrews and 1 John.
Let us unpack the specific variations in this chart. When Paul writes to the Corinthians, or the Galatians, or the Ephesians, he frequently leans on the title apostle right away.
He does.
But here in Romans, addressing the absolute epicenter of global authority, he introduces himself with two specific titles. He writes, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel.
That was a very deliberate choice of words.
Right. Now, I want to stop on that first word, servant. The Greek word is doulos. In modern English, servant sounds almost, I do not know, respectable.
Yeah, it really does.
It sounds like a butler at an estate, someone who gets paid a decent wage, has a union, and goes home to their own family at 5 o'clock.
Yes, the English translation softens the reality considerably, and we lose the shock value of the original text. The word doulos literally translates to slave.
Okay, wow.
It refers to a person entirely owned by another, someone who's considered living property. We have to place this in the Roman context. Slavery in the Roman Empire was ubiquitous, and it was notoriously brutal.
Right, because you had individuals working in mines or forced into gladiatorial combat.
Exactly, or performing menial labor under the absolute dictatorial control of a master. A doulos had no rights, no autonomy, and no personal agency. Their entire existence was dictated by the will of their owner.
Wait, so Paul is a Roman citizen, The Book of Acts makes a huge deal out of his citizenship.
It certainly does.
Why would a born Roman citizen willingly adopt the title of doulos in a letter addressed to people living in Rome, the very city that enforced that brutal system?
It is a great question.
I mean, that seems like a radical, almost foolish subversion of social status. Why degrade yourself in front of the most status-obsessed culture on the planet?
That is the brilliance of the introduction. He is deliberately subverting their status hierarchy. But the commentary draws our attention to a very specific Old Testament framework that dictates Paul's use of this word. He is not talking about Roman chattel slavery. He is utilizing the imagery from the book of Exodus, chapter 21.
Walk us through that connection. What happens in Exodus 21?
In Exodus 21, verses 2 through 6, the Mosaic Law outlines a scenario involving an indentured servant. The law stated that after 6 years of labor, the servant had fulfilled his time and was legally free to walk away.
Right, they get their freedom.
But the text provides a specific caveat. If that servant realizes that he loves his master and loves the wife and children he acquired during his time there, he can voluntarily reject his freedom.
Wow, really?
Yes, he can choose to remain a slave for life. The process was highly symbolic. The master would take the servant to the doorpost of the house and pierce his ear with an awl, permanently marking him as a willing bondservant forever.
Okay, so applying that to Paul's introduction, he is declaring that his submission to Jesus Christ is total and absolute, but it is entirely voluntary. It is born out of affection, not coercion. He is essentially saying, I have evaluated the so-called freedom the world offers, and I have decided that being completely owned by Jesus Christ is infinitely better than belonging to myself.
That is it. His ear is symbolically to the doorpost. And then he pairs that posture of absolute submission with his second title, apostle.
Right.
The commentary defines an apostle as one sent with delegated authority. He was called to this specific position by God. His calling involved being set apart. The Greek concept here is aphoresis.
I want to push back on this idea of being set apart, because the commentary contrasts Paul's separation with the separation practiced by the religious elite of his day, the Pharisees.
Right.
The word Pharisee literally means separated one. So if Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees before his conversion, isn't he just carrying over the exact same mindset?
It might seem that way on the surface.
Yeah, what makes his use of aphoresia different from the Pharisees' version of separation?
The direction of the separation is completely opposite. For the Pharisees, their identity was defined by isolation and segregation. They separated themselves from the rest of humanity.
Ah, I see.
Yes, from Gentiles, from sinners, from the messy reality of the world to maintain their own ceremonial purity. Their separation was a barrier.
Okay.
But Paul's use of aphoresia flips the concept.
Hmm.
He is not hiding behind a religious wall. He is mingling freely with all levels of pagan society. He is sitting in marketplaces, making tents with common laborers, speaking in philosophical arenas.
It sounds like the difference between someone living in a sterile, concrete underground bunker to avoid catching a disease versus a frontline combat medic.
Oh, that is a fantastic analogy.
Think about it. The person in the bunker is separated from the world, terrified of contamination.
Yeah.
But the frontline medic, they are absolutely set apart. They are wearing a distinct uniform, they operate under different rules of engagement, and they have a singular driving mission.
Right, very distinct.
But to accomplish that mission, they are fully immersed in the mud, the blood, and the chaotic reality of the battlefield. They have to be covered in the mess to administer the cure. Paul is that medic. He is completely dedicated to the gospel, which means he has to be right in the middle of pagan society.
The friction of that analogy works flawlessly with the text. He is embedded in the culture, fully engaged, because the message he carries requires an audience.
Absolutely.
And that transitions us naturally to the core of his message. If he is the willing bondservant and the embedded medic, what is the cure he is carrying?
Well, let us look at verses 2 through 4 of the first chapter. Paul immediately roots his message in history. He says this gospel was promised beforehand through God's prophets in the Holy Scriptures.
Yes, he does.
Now, for the modern reader, Holy Scriptures usually means the leather-bound book with both the Old and New Testaments. But for Paul's original audience, that meant one thing exclusively.
It meant the Old Testament. This is a detail we often gloss over in modern reading. When Paul, Peter, and the early church were preaching the gospel across the Roman Empire, the New Testament did not exist.
That is a wild thought.
It really is. They were actively living it out. They were in the process of writing the letters that would become it, but they could not open a New Testament scroll to validate their claims. They relied entirely on the Old Testament texts to prove that Jesus of Nazareth was the promised Messiah.
The commentary illustrates this by pointing us to the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. It is a brilliant picture of this dynamic.
It is a perfect example.
Philip runs up to a chariot in the desert. The Ethiopian official is reading the scroll of Isaiah, specifically the passage in chapter 53 about a sheep being led to the slaughter. He asks Philip who the prophet is talking about.
Right.
And the text in Acts says that Philip started right there from that specific Old Testament passage and preached the good news about Jesus to him.
This historical rooting proves that the gospel was not a sudden, disconnected innovation. It was not a new religion invented in a vacuum. It was the deliberate fulfillment of a centuries-long promise.
Which gives it immense credibility.
Absolutely. And the central subject of that ancient promise, Paul explains in verses 3 and 4, is God's Son. Paul provides an incredibly dense, concentrated definition of the dual nature of Jesus Christ right here in the introduction.
I want to parse the language he uses because the commentary draws a sharp distinction here. Paul identifies him as Jesus Christ our Lord, which asserts his deity as basic to his person, existing prior to his incarnation.
Yes.
But then he uses a specific Greek participle regarding his humanity, which is genomino.
Genomino literally translates to came to be. The text says he was made or came to be of the seed of David according to the flesh.
So it is emphasizing the physical reality.
Yes, this phrasing points undeniably to his genuine humanity. He possessed a human lineage. He had a direct human tie to David's ancestral line. He stepped into the timeline of human history, taking on physical human flesh.
But then we hit verse 4, and the text pivots from his human lineage to his divine status. He came from David's line according to the flesh, but he was declared to be the Son of God in capability according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead.
Right, that is a huge shift.
I need to pause here and ask a critical question. When my modern, logical brain reads the phrase, declared to be the Son of God by the resurrection, my immediate instinct is to think, well, so he wasn't the Son of God until he rose from the dead.
A lot of people wonder that.
Right. Did the resurrection event actually make him divine? Did he earn his deity by surviving death?
It absolutely did not make him the Son of God. The commentary is exceedingly careful to clarify this point. The resurrection validated his claims to deity.
Okay, validated, not created.
Correct. Throughout his earthly ministry, Jesus made specific predictions that he would be killed and would rise from the dead. We see this explicitly in John chapter 2 and Matthew chapter 16. He was already the Son of God from eternity past.
So it is public proof.
Yes. The resurrection was the universal, undeniable proof of that pre-existing reality.
It is like a royal coronation ceremony. When a prince has a coronation and the crown is placed on his head, that physical ceremony does not inject royal blood into his veins.
Right. He already has it.
He already possesses the royal blood. He was born with it. The ceremony is simply the public, legally binding validation and declaration to the entire watching world of who he actually is. The resurrection was the ultimate cosmic coronation event.
That is an incredibly accurate picture. And Paul specifies that this declaration was made in accord with the Spirit of holiness.
What does that mean, practically?
Well, there's been speculation over the centuries that this phrase refers to Christ's own human spirit, suggesting he maintained a perfect moral life through human discipline. But the commentary clarifies that Spirit of holiness is a direct reference to the Holy Spirit.
Oh, that makes sense.
So in this dense theological introduction, you have this beautifully orchestrated Trinitarian action. The Son willingly takes on human flesh. He dies. And the Holy Spirit operates as the active agent in the resurrection to declare the Son's deity to the universe.
Man, Paul has laid a massive theological foundation in just 4 verses. He has established his identity, and he has established the historical and divine reality of his message.
He really wastes no time.
Moving into verses 8 through 15, the tone shifts. He turns his attention directly to the people living in Rome, and he starts building rapport.
He follows a very specific methodology here, one that becomes his standard practice across his epistles. He begins with a word of thanks to God, followed by a specific prayer for the recipients, and then a personal message explaining his intentions.
He tells the Roman believers that he thanks God because their faith is being reported all over the world.
Which is quite a statement.
Yeah. The commentary notes that this is a clear use of hyperbole, obviously meaning throughout the vast reach of the Roman Empire, not literally the entire globe. But it highlights how visible the church in Rome was.
Rome was the political, cultural, and economic center of the known world. Whatever happened in Rome echoed outward along the trade routes and military roads.
So it was very strategic.
Very. If a community of believers was thriving under the nose of Caesar, everyone in the empire would eventually hear about it. But what is truly gripping here is Paul's explanation of why he is so eager to visit them. He lays out a threefold reason.
Okay, what are they?
First, he wants to strengthen them by imparting some spiritual gift. The commentary suggests this means either exercising his own apostolic gift on their behalf to establish them, or bestowing on them spiritual favors and blessings.
That sounds typical for an apostle.
Yes. Second, he wants to see a spiritual harvest among them, just like he has witnessed among other Gentile populations.
Those first two reasons make complete sense. But the third reason is where the text catches me off guard. He says he wants to be strengthened by them in return.
This reveals the psychological brilliance and the genuine humility of Paul's approach. Think about the credentials he has just outlined in the preceding verses.
Right, they are unmatched.
He is an apostle called directly by the risen Christ. He is actively writing authoritative scripture. He possesses an unmatched theological pedigree. He could easily adopt a posture of absolute superiority.
He could just talk down to them.
He really could. He could write to them and say, I am the great apostle Paul, and I am coming to fix your flawed theology and dispense my vast wisdom to you. But instead, he deliberately lowers himself. He positions himself as a fellow weary traveler who desperately needs their encouragement just as much as they need his teaching.
It creates a mutual dependency. It levels the playing field before he begins his heavy theological instruction.
Exactly.
And then he uses a phrase in verse 14 that always requires a second look. He says, I am a debtor. He feels an immense, crushing obligation to the entire human race.
It is a striking claim.
He specifically mentions both Greeks and non-Greeks, which literally translates to barbarians, meaning anyone living outside the refined Greco-Roman cultural sphere. He also mentions the wise and the foolish, meaning the uncultured or uneducated masses.
He views his apostolic calling not as a prestigious privilege to be hoarded, but as an unpaid debt that he owes to people he has never laid eyes on.
Conceptually, how does that work? If I walk down the street, I do not owe a debt to a random stranger unless I borrowed money from them.
Right. That is how we normally think of debt.
How do you owe a massive debt to a barbarian living in a forest who has done absolutely nothing for you? But when you analyze it, it makes sense if you look at it through the lens of a medical crisis. Let us say a doctor spends years in a laboratory and finally synthesizes the absolute guaranteed cure for a highly contagious, fatal disease that is rapidly wiping out a city. The doctor does not owe a debt to the sick people because those sick people did him a favor.
No, they didn't do anything for it.
Right. He owes them the cure because the creator of the cure handed the vials to him for the specific, exclusive purpose of distribution. The debt is generated entirely by the possession of the remedy.
That is a powerful way to frame it.
Paul holds the sole cure for human death, given to him directly by God. So he looks out at the entire Gentile world, the cultured philosophers in Athens, the uneducated laborers in the provinces, and says, I hold your cure. I owe you this message.
That intense, driving sense of obligation, that feeling of an unpaid debt burning a hole in his pocket, provides the perfect logical bridge. It brings Paul to the absolute climax of his introduction.
The thesis statement.
Yeah, the thesis statement that governs the entire letter to the Romans.
We arrive at verses 16 and 17. The thesis. Justification by faith. Paul writes, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the capability of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. Now, our commentary notes that his sheer eagerness to get to Rome springs directly from his estimation of what this message actually consists of.
We need to analyze the specific Greek word he uses here to describe the capability of the gospel. The word is dynamis.
Dynamis.
Yes. It represents infinite divine capacity. It is God's sheer spiritual ability applied directly, with pinpoint accuracy, toward the goal of salvation in the life of a believer. The gospel is not merely good advice. It is not a moral framework or a self-help manual for living a better life.
Right. It is an active force.
It is an active, dynamic force that alters reality.
And he says this salvation is available to everyone who believes, but he immediately adds a priority qualifier. First to the Jew, then to the Gentile.
This qualifier often raises a significant question for readers. Does God play favorites based on ethnicity?
That is always the first question.
And the commentary clarifies this beautifully. This priority is not about inherent human worth. It is a historical and chronological preference of privilege.
Okay.
The Jewish people were God's chosen nation historically. They were the custodians of God's divine revelation. They faithfully preserved the Old Testament texts for centuries. And most significantly, the Messiah came directly through their physical lineage.
So it makes chronological sense in the unfolding of history. We see this pattern play out repeatedly in the book of Acts. Whenever Paul arrived in a new, unfamiliar city on his missionary journeys, where did he go first? He went straight to the local synagogue.
Every time.
He offered the message of the Messiah to the custodians of the promise first. But when they rejected it, he pivoted and offered it to the Gentiles. It was a sequential rollout of the message.
That historical sequence preserves God's faithfulness to his promises. And that brings us to verse 17, which is arguably the most fiercely debated and heavily analyzed verse in all of Pauline literature.
Oh, absolutely.
For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written. The righteous will live by faith.
Let us unpack this phrase, a righteousness from God. The commentary labels this a subjective genitive. Break that grammatical term down for a listener who does not read Greek syntax.
In Greek grammar, categorizing this phrase as a subjective genitive means that this righteousness is not describing an internal attribute that God inherently possesses, even though we know God is perfectly righteous in his character.
Okay, so it is not about his own internal state.
Right. Rather, in this specific context, it means this is a righteousness that God actively produces and provides for human beings. It is a legal status that originates entirely from God and is handed to humanity on the sole basis of faith.
That we cannot earn it.
It is completely 100% unachievable by any amount of human moral effort.
It is a God kind of righteousness. And the linguistic connection here is vital for understanding the whole book. In English, the noun righteousness and the verb justify sound completely disconnected. You would not naturally associate them in a sentence.
No, you wouldn't.
But in the original Greek text, they share the exact same root.
The noun for righteousness is dikaiosino, and the verb to justify is dikaio. Paul uses the noun 28 times throughout Romans, and the verb 15 times. They are inextricably linked concepts. You cannot understand one without the other.
So we need to define this verb carefully. What does it actually mean to justify someone?
To justify a person is to declare them forensically or legally righteous. We need to visualize a formal courtroom setting here to grasp the mechanics.
Okay, set the scene.
The perfect holy judge sits on the bench. The human defendant stands accused. The evidence of guilt is overwhelming and undeniable. But justification is the precise moment the judge brings the gavel down and makes a stunning legal declaration. Righteous, cleared, acquitted. It is crucial to understand that this declaration is not a description of the defendant's internal moral perfection. It is a declaration of their objective legal standing before the court.
I have to stop you there and push back on this courtroom scenario, because if we are setting up a courtroom where God is a perfectly just judge and humanity is the guilty defendant, there is a massive logical problem.
What is that?
If a human judge in a human court looks at a defendant who is caught red-handed, guilty of horrific crimes, and the judge just drops the gavel and says, cleared, acquitted, go home, we do not call that judge merciful. We call that judge corrupt.
We do.
We call for that judge to be disbarred.
Yeah.
How can God be a perfect judge if he is just clearing guilty rebels? Doesn't forensic justification make God an unjust judge?
That is the very friction the text is designed to create, and it is the central dilemma of the entire Christian faith.
Yeah.
How can a just God justify the ungodly? The answer lies in the mechanism of imputation. The judge does not simply ignore the crimes or sweep the guilt under the rug. The penalty for the crimes must be paid in full for justice to be satisfied.
Okay.
Imputation means that God takes the perfect, sinless record of Jesus Christ and credits it to the account of the guilty defendant. And simultaneously, the guilt of the defendant is credited to Christ on the cross, where the penalty is executed.
Ah, so there is an exchange.
Yes. So when the judge drops the gavel and declares acquitted, he's doing so because the legal demands of justice have been completely satisfied by a substitute.
This highlights the critical difference between imputed righteousness and imparted righteousness, correct? I want to make sure we get this distinction crystal clear, because confusing the two leads to massive theological errors.
It is a vital, non-negotiable distinction.
Yeah.
Imputed righteousness, which is justification, happens instantly the very moment you believe. God legally credits Christ's perfect record to your account. Yes. Imparted righteousness, on the other hand, is the slow, progressive work of God actually changing your internal desires and daily behavior to gradually match that perfect legal standing. We call that progressive process sanctification.
Think of the distinction like this. Imagine you are utterly bankrupt. You owe millions of dollars in debt. You are living on the street, destitute.
A terrible situation.
Imputed righteousness is like a generous billionaire walking into the bank and transferring their entire vast fortune directly into your empty account. The bank manager looks at the computer screen, sees the new balance, and declares you a billionaire.
That is the legal reality.
That is your objective, legal, financial standing. You are instantly wealthy on paper. The debt is gone. That is justification.
And imparted righteousness in that scenario.
Imparted righteousness is the slow, arduous, daily process of actually learning how to live like a wealthy person. The day after the money is transferred, you might still wake up and try to eat out of a dumpster out of sheer habit.
Right, the mindset hasn't changed yet.
You still think like a bankrupt person. Imparted righteousness is the lifelong process of learning to manage the funds, changing your destructive habits, and aligning your actual behavior with your new legal reality. The legal status happens in a fraction of a second, but the behavioral change takes a lifetime.
That is a very helpful analogy.
Paul is talking here in verse 17 exclusively about the legal declaration, the imputed standing. And he proves the historical validity of this concept by quoting the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 4. The righteous will live by faith.
This is a monumental, universe-altering claim. God has provided a mechanism for legal perfection strictly through faith. But laying out this glorious solution immediately raises an immense, glaring question for the reader.
It really does.
If God has gone to such incredible, agonizing lengths to provide this legal righteousness, why do we need it so desperately? What is wrong with humanity that requires such a drastic intervention?
And that logical question pulls us directly into verses 18 through 20. The absolute need for righteousness, demonstrated by the total condemnation of pagan humanity. Paul takes us from the soaring heights of legal acquittal and plunges us straight into the absolute, suffocating depths of the human condition.
Verse 18 acts as the topic sentence for this entire downward diagnostic section, and it stands in direct contrastive parallel to the thesis in verse 17.
How so?
Well, verse 17 talks about the continuing present revelation of God's righteousness. Verse 18 talks about the continuing present revelation of God's wrath from heaven.
Let us examine that wrath. The commentary points out that it is directed against two specific targets, godlessness and wickedness. The Greek words used here are asebion and adikion.
Asebion translates to a lack of proper reverence for God. It is an internal fundamental posture of dismissal and rebellion toward the Creator.
And
Adikion is the external behavioral result of that internal posture. Unrighteousness or wickedness enacted toward other people. And the commentary makes a very crucial theological point here that we must grasp.
which is?
God hates sin and actively judges it, but he loves sinners and desires their salvation. His wrath is not a volatile, unpredictable human temper tantrum. It is the necessary expression of his perfect personal righteousness reacting against human sinfulness. A holy God cannot tolerate evil.
But the text is clear that he does not condemn humanity arbitrarily. The commentary lays out the specific evidence-based reasons for this universal condemnation. Reason number one, humanity is actively suppressing the truth. The Greek word Paul uses is katenkort.
Literally translated, it means holding down. And we must understand the active muscular nature of this word.
It is not passive.
This is not passive ignorance at all. This is not describing someone who just happens to not know the truth about God because they were isolated on a mountain and never told. This describes a deliberate, active, willful resistance against a truth they already inherently possess.
I think of the mechanics of suppression like trying to hold a fully inflated beach ball underwater in a swimming pool.
Oh, that takes a lot of effort.
If you have ever tried to do that, you know it takes constant, exhausting, deliberate physical effort. The natural state of that beach ball is to violently burst up to the surface. It wants to float. Reality wants to be known.
Yes.
The truth of God's existence wants to break the surface of human consciousness. But humanity is actively, exhaustingly pushing the beach ball down, trying to keep reality submerged, because they do not want to deal with the moral implications of it popping up to the surface.
The friction of that analogy is key. The water pressure is constant. The beach ball wants to surface. So what happens to the person holding it down?
I get tired.
Their arms get tired. They get spiritually and intellectually exhausted. Eventually, their entire focus in life becomes about maintaining the cover-up. They are holding down the truth in an attitude of wickedness.
Wow.
But what exactly is this specific truth they are working so hard to suppress? That brings us to reason number two for their condemnation. ignoring natural revelation.
We see this in verses 19 and 20. Paul argues that what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain.
The Greek word for plain is phaneron, meaning visible, clear, or manifest. God has placed the evidence right in front of their faces. This is the theological concept of natural revelation.
Right.
It is the knowledge of God that is universally accessible to the entire human race simply by observing the architecture of the created world. Now, natural revelation is not soteriological, meaning looking at a tree does not tell you the specific historical story of Jesus dying on a cross for sins, but it unequivocally tells you that a massive, intelligent creator exists.
Let me stop you right there, because a skeptical listener might think, wait a minute, I look at nature and I see a brutal food chain. I see natural disasters, disease, and chaos. I do not necessarily see a perfect divine architect right away.
That is a very common objection.
So how does Paul claim that God's invisible qualities are clearly seen?
The commentary breaks down verse 20 to answer that exact skepticism. It points out that God's invisible qualities, specifically his eternal might and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the very creation of the world.
Okay.
The Greek word for divine nature here is theodos. It only occurs this one time in the New Testament, and it encompasses all the properties that make God. Paul is arguing from the law of cause and effect. Creation is a mirror reflecting the unseen character of the cause.
So the complexity points to a designer.
Yes, the staggering intricacies of a single human cell, the mathematical precision of planetary orbits, the laws of physics, they all scream of a designer with infinite capability. Paul may even be using a deliberate play on words here between the Greek noun for invisible qualities and the verb for clearly seen, as they share a common root in the original language. The invisible reality is made undeniably visible through the physical things that are made.
And the conclusion Paul draws from this overwhelming evidence is devastating. Because of this constant natural revelation, humanity is without excuse.
That is a staggering, terrifying phrase.
Yeah.
It means their legal condemnation before the judge is not based on rejecting a specific gospel message they have not heard.
Right.
It is not about someone on a remote island being punished because a missionary never arrived with the Bible. Their judgment is based entirely on sinning against the light they do possess. The witness of the natural world is so constant, so loud, and so undeniable that ignoring it is simply legally indefensible.
So if humanity possesses the truth but actively pushes the beach ball underwater, what happens next? What fills the psychological and intellectual void in the human mind when you successfully suppress the reality of the Creator?
That brings us to verses 21 through 23, the downward spiral, humanity perverting God's glory. Paul traces the cognitive and moral collapse that inevitably, mechanically follows the rejection of the Creator.
Verse 21 starts with a fascinating historical premise. For although they knew God, the commentary points out this refers to an original, experiential knowledge of God, much like Adam and Eve possessed in the garden.
Yes, humanity did not start out in absolute primitive ignorance and slowly, intellectually, climb their way up to the noble idea of monotheism. They started with a clear knowledge of God, and they willfully descended into darkness.
And Paul identifies their foundational root failure. They knew him, but they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him.
It is a total rejection of purpose.
They flatly refused to honor his person, and they refused to express gratitude for his daily provisions. They turned away from the very fundamental purpose for which human beings were designed.
And the results of that refusal are immediate, and they are terrifying.
Right.
Paul says their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened.
Let us examine the Greek words here because they carry immense diagnostic weight. Futile thinking is ematashasan, which literally translates to became worthless or purposeless.
Think about the mechanics of human reasoning. Without the Creator serving as the ultimate anchor point for objective reality, human reasoning loses its true north.
It loses its grounding.
It loses its purpose. It just spins its wheels in the mud. And then their hearts became asinados, meaning morally senseless or without understanding.
There is a direct, undeniable causal correlation in the text between recognizing God and possessing a functioning, rational mind. When you reject the source of all wisdom, cognitive collapse is not just a possibility, it is a guaranteed mechanical outcome.
It has to happen.
When objective truth is rejected, your actual intellectual capacity to recognize truth moving forward is severely impaired.
And that cognitive impairment leads to the ultimate irony in verse 22. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools.
Fools.
Yes, The Greek word for fools is amarantheison, which bluntly means they became stupid. They boasted loudly of their intellectual enlightenment, their philosophy, their sophisticated Roman culture, all while plunging headlong into cognitive darkness.
And how does this supreme stupidity manifest itself practically? Verse 23 says, they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Idolatry.
The commentary points us back to the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, chapter 44, to truly grasp the sheer insanity of idolatry. Isaiah paints this highly sarcastic, brilliant picture.
I love that passage.
A man goes into the forest and cuts down a tree. With half of the wood, he builds a fire to warm his hands and bake his daily bread. He burns it to ash. With the exact same piece of wood from the exact same tree, he carves a little statue, bows down to it, and says, "Save me, you are my God."
It is absolute, undeniable, logical absurdity.
It really is.
Now, a modern listener reads that and thinks, well, I do not carve wooden birds or reptiles and bow down to them in my living room, so I must be doing okay. I have evolved past that. But the underlying principle remains identically the same. The core sin is worshiping the creature rather than the creator.
It just takes different forms.
How does this manifest in our modern world? We still make the exchange. We worship human intellect and scientific progress. We worship technology as our ultimate savior. We worship self-actualization, constantly gazing at our own reflection, seeking our own inner truth as if we are the divine authority over our own lives.
It is the exact same exchange.
The exact same idolatry, just coated with a modern digital veneer.
It is the catastrophic rejection of the infinite in favor of the finite. And faced with this systemic, willful, historical rebellion across all of human history, we have to ask the logical question, how does a holy God respond to this?
And the answer to that question takes us into verses 24 through 32, the terrifying judgment. When we think of divine judgment, we usually picture thunderbolts from the sky, floods, or fire and brimstone. But the judgment Paul describes here is actually terrifying in its sheer passivity.
Yes, God's judgment is enacted through the terrifying mechanism of abandonment. 3 separate times in these verses, Paul utilizes the Greek word pardukin, which translates to gave them over or abandoned.
God gave them over. Those might be the 4 most frightening words in the entire biblical text.
They really are.
The commentary notes that the catastrophic results of this condemnation are, in one sense, just the natural mechanical consequences of suppressing truth, but God acts judicially by actively letting go.
He removes his restraining grace.
Yes. He stops holding humanity back from its own destructive desires and allows them to have the precise thing they are violently demanding, life without his interference.
And Paul describes this divine abandonment in 3 distinct progressive phases. Phase 1 is found in verses 24 and 25. God abandons them to impurity, specifically to the degrading of their bodies with one another. Why? Because they exchange the truth of God for the lie.
Let us carefully define the lie. The commentary states that the fundamental truth is that people are created beings who find their ultimate fulfillment only in worshiping and depending on the Creator.
That is the truth.
The lie is the arrogant belief that a creature, whether human or angelic, can exist independently of God, that we can be entirely self-sufficient, self-directing, and self-fulfilling.
It is the echo of the original lie whispered in the Garden of Eden. You will be like God. Humanity decided to make itself its own God. And Paul concludes this first phase of abandonment by interjecting a doxology, affirming that the Creator is forever praised, and he adds the word Amen.
Amen.
This word transliterates directly from Hebrew to Greek and into English, meaning so let it be. It is a solid, immovable affirmation of God's worthiness, standing in sharp contrast to the chaos of human rebellion.
Then we move to phase 2 of the abandonment, detailed in verses 26 and 27. Because of this exchange, God gave them over to passions of disgrace. The text states this involved exchanging natural relations for unnatural ones.
We need to look closely at the commentary's exegesis of this specific passage, and we will report it impartially based strictly on the text.
Right, just sticking to the source material here.
The commentary notes that the words translated women and men in these verses are strictly the biological, sexual words, females and males. The text describes a scenario where females exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones with other females, and males were inflamed with lust. The specific Greek word is orexai, meaning intense, burning sexual lust for other males committing indecent acts.
The commentary explicitly states that the only natural sexual relationship the biblical text recognizes is a heterosexual one within the bounds of marriage, referencing Jesus' own words in Matthew 19 and the original design in Genesis 2.
It does.
The commentary argues against contemporary interpretations that try to suggest Paul was only condemning heterosexual individuals acting against their own personal preferences. It maintains that the text views all deviations from the original heterosexual standard as a direct resulting manifestation of this divine abandonment, carrying within them the due penalty of their error.
This is a stark exposition of Paul's diagnostic view of human society. The logic he is tracing is that when the foundational theological truth of the Creator is removed, the physical design of the creature becomes entirely distorted. The rejection of the designer leads to the rejection of the design.
It is a complete unraveling.
Which leads us to the final, most devastating phase of the abandonment in verses 28 through 32.
Phase 3. Because they rejected the full knowledge of God, the Greek word used here is epignousē. God abandoned them to a depraved mind.
The word for depraved here is adokimon, which translates to disapproved or unfit. It was actually a technical term used in the ancient world for metallurgy.
Like purifying metals.
Yes. When a metal was tested in the fire and failed the test, proving to be full of impurities, it was called a dokimon. It was thrown out as useless slag. Because humanity forcefully put God out of their minds became fundamentally defective and unfit for their original purpose.
And nature abhors a vacuum. When you deliberately empty the human mind of the knowledge of God, it does not just sit there in a state of peaceful neutrality. It immediately fills up with something else.
It floods with chaos.
The commentary notes that this mental vacuum was filled full with 4 primary forms of active sin: wickedness, evil, greed, and malice.
And from those 4 massive root vices spring 17 more specific, detailed types of wickedness. Paul is painting a chaotic, horrifying portrait of a society completely unhinged from reality.
It's just so bleak.
And he uses brilliant rhetorical devices in the original language to make his point memorable for the reader. For instance, he pairs the Greek words for envy and murder. Phonu and phonu.
Oh, they rhyme.
They sound almost identical when spoken aloud, suggesting to the listener that the internal attitude of envy is just a hair's breadth away from the physical act of murder.
He also lists 4 specific vices in verse 31 that all begin with the Greek letter alpha, creating this rapid-fire staccato effect of condemnation: senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless.
It hits hard.
It is a relentless, pounding barrage showing the total collapse of all human relations when God is abandoned.
And then Paul hits the absolute rock bottom of the downward spiral in verse 32, the climax of human rebellion. He says they do these things while fully knowing, the word is pions, possessing full knowledge, that God's righteous decree dictates that those who practice such things deserve death.
But they do it anyway.
But they do not just practice them in secret. They actively encourage and applaud others who practice them.
I really want us to reflect on that specific verse for a moment.
Wow.
Why is applauding others' sin seen as the absolute bottom, the lowest possible point of the downward spiral?
It is a chilling thought.
Think about the psychology of it this way. It is the difference between a person quietly, desperately struggling with a horrible, life-destroying addiction in the privacy of their own home, and a person who decides to actively open up a clinic to get everyone else in their neighborhood addicted to the exact same substance, all while running a public relations campaign calling the addiction a virtue.
That is a staggering contrast.
The first scenario is a tragic moral failure. The second scenario is a malicious, calculated campaign to normalize destruction. When you not only practice the rebellion, but demand that society celebrate it, you have reached the terminal velocity of the fall. You have completely inverted morality.
And that total inversion of morality fully warrants the continuing revelation of God's wrath that Paul introduced all the way back in verse 18.
What a massive, heavy amount of ground we have covered today. We started at the surface, looking at the customary mechanics of ancient letter writing, watching Paul subvert Roman social structures by identifying himself as a willing bondservant and an embedded frontline medic for the gospel.
We examine the staggering reality of forensic justification. At that courtroom where the perfect judge imputes the flawless legal standing of Jesus Christ to the bankrupt account of the guilty believer by faith alone.
And then we took that terrifying dive down the diagnostic spiral. We saw the sheer exhaustion of humanity actively holding the beach ball of truth underwater, suppressing the obvious natural revelation of the Creator seen in the physical world.
We traced the mechanical cognitive collapse into futile thinking.
The logical insanity of idolatry and the terrifying passive judgment of God simply handing humanity over to the catastrophic consequences of their own desires, culminating in a society that throws a parade for its own destruction.
It is a highly dark diagnostic picture, but it is absolutely necessary because you cannot appreciate the sheer brilliance and necessity of the rescue until you understand the absolute suffocating hopelessness of the condition.
You really cannot.
Paul has to systematically tear down every single human excuse before he can begin to build up the mechanism of grace.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the text of Romans chapter 1, I want to leave you with a lingering question, a thought for you to mull over based on the text we just dissected.
I love leaving a thought like this.
The text argues forcefully that suppressing the truth leads inevitably to a darkened, futile mind. Even as believers, even for those of us who possess the gospel and have experienced that forensic justification we talked about, the human flesh is still drawn toward autonomy. So in what subtle, everyday, easily justifiable ways might you still be trying to hold a beach ball of truth underwater just to maintain a little bit of independence from God?
That is the diagnostic question that demands our attention long after we close the book.
Thank you so much for joining us for this extensive analysis. We appreciate you taking the time to listen, to learn, and to critically engage with the text alongside us. Have a wonderful day.